Hi, I'm Angela Saini. I'm a science journalist and author, and Superior is my third book. And I'm stood here in the ancient history section of Waterstones, partly because my book really is rooted in the past. I think understanding the history of race science and race is the best way to understand why racism still exists today, why we still live with it. If you look at the roots of racism, I think sometimes we imagine that these ideas that we have about race today in the modern world have been around forever, and they really haven't. They're quite relatively recent. So while people in the past, the ancients, obviously did recognize human difference, and especially as people traveled all over the world, they would have recognized that different groups of people have differences. The only times those differences really mattered was when they became relative to power. So if you look through ancient history, you can see that power is most often the pretext for emphasizing difference. The ancient Romans did it, the Egyptians did it. Whenever people become powerful, they start to treat everybody beneath them, other people who they've conquered or they treat as slaves, as somehow naturally inferior. And this really, I think, came to a height during the Enlightenment. So if we look at Enlightenment, the birth of Western modern science, you can see scientists, male, white, European scientists generally, start to classify human beings the way that they were classifying the rest of the natural world, plants and animals, and with a very cursory understanding of how human difference actually worked, they slotted us into certain categories and then very quickly assumed that there were hierarchies between those categories. And of course, being white and European, they put themselves at the peak. So the male white European was at the top of this racial and gender hierarchy, and the rest of us were slotted in various places underneath. And that reflected the power dynamics of the time. And so what you see from the Enlightenment all the way up to the Second World War is these ideas about race, this racial hierarchy, being used to defend slavery and colonialism, genocide, all the greatest evils of the last few hundred years can be pinned to this idea that somehow we are fundamentally different deep down. Well, I've moved now to the science section. Superior at its heart is a science book. So while I think history is kind of crucial to understanding the history of race, because first and foremost, it's a historical idea, it's a social and cultural idea, it is a social construct. But the way that scientists have manipulated it and used it and built it up until today we think of it as completely tangible. Race feels so real to us now. I feel like I know what my race is, even though at the time that it was devised, it was completely arbitrary. So for example, the man who came up with the idea of Caucasian, so this was Johann Blumenbach, who was a kind of explorer, early scientist, if you like, researcher. He defined Caucasian as everyone from North India all the way up to Western Europe, which would make me Caucasian. And yet today, Caucasian is a kind of polite word we use to call people, to describe white people. It feels scientific, but it never was. It was always arbitrary. It still is quite arbitrary. And I think this is the interesting thing about how we think about race now within the sciences, is that scientists tell us race is a social construct. We've been told this for 70 years, and yet again and again they keep invoking race within their research. We see it in genetics, even modern day ancestry testing. So when you spit into a cup and send your DNA off to get tested, and it tells you that you're 96% South Asian, as I was, or 50% this and 50% that, it makes race feel real, because if you can do that, then how can it not be real? And also in medicine, we're told that different ethnicities have different propensities to certain illnesses and diseases. So again, race starts to feel as though it's real. And what I wanted to get to the heart of in Superior is, which one is it? Is it a social construct, or is it biologically real? And the truth is quite complicated. There are some average statistical differences between certain groups of people, but at the same time, we are overwhelmingly very, very similar, homogeneous as a species. In fact, far more homogeneous than chimpanzees, for instance. They show far more genetic diversity between them. It is this kind of uncertainty within the science and the tendency, I feel, of scientists to still invoke race even when they shouldn't, that in some sense has also become exploited by scientific racists, so people who want to use science or abuse science to prop up or justify their prejudices. I think the main point of the book is not to argue with those racists, because frankly they will reach for whatever they want. They will always be reaching for the next tiny scrap of facts to justify their prejudices. What I want to reach out to is every single one of us who still shows some commitment to the idea of race, and I think we all do, I think I do as well, who still uses these ideas not just in a social and cultural way, but also in a biological way, that we kind of cross that divide, warning us that this is a dangerous thing to do and also a very unscientific thing to do.